So today we're going to be mostly just reacting to all of the WoW news that was released today because a ton of it was released today. And yeah, Alpha is here officially. War Within Alpha is here. Obviously, you had a bunch of content creators that got pulled into the kind of NDA version of Alpha where they couldn't disclose anything, but they were playing it, messing around with it because a ton of them had videos and content released like hours within the announcement about all aspects of the game. So shout outs to those guys. I am not obviously part of that. Otherwise, I would have taken this week off from work and probably spent a lot of time doing a bunch of stuff. But what I'm going to do today is go over basically most of the important news. I'm probably not going to get to all of it, but we're going to keep an eye on the things that seem the most interesting to me, and I'm going to kind of group them together. We're going to start with Mythic Plus stuff because, as you can see this year, the Season 1 dungeon rotation. Spoiler, I hate this, and I'll go off here in a little bit as to why. So I'm going to group everything dungeons together, and then obviously there's some class stuff. Obviously, Monk got announced. Basically, they're getting their trees reworked. Druid did as well, so I want to take a look at both of those and see if, like, what possibility we have. New hero talent trees got released. Monk was included in that, so we're going to go over that tonight. And then just talk about some of the things that I think are pretty cool or pretty interesting from some of the other announcements. So we're going to be in for a long haul. This will be a long stream. Well, long for me because I only stream generally about 3 hours at a time. But I might go a little bit longer tonight. And then if anyone is around still and cool, I might do more bear keys because I'm trying to gear the druid up so that I can have it ready to go for Season 4, where I have a personal goal of 3k on the monk and 3k on the druid. So yeah, that's the plan. All right, so I'm going to start with this. And this is, like I said, this is the thing that I'm probably going to be the most negative about. So I just want to get this out of the way early, because when I saw this news initially, like, someone tagged me in Discord for it, and not my guild Discord, but another one, because they know how much I love this, and they showed me the dungeons. I was like 5 minutes short of being on lunch, and I literally was like, yo, I'm gonna take an extra 5 for lunch because, like, work was kind of stressful anyways, and like nobody questioned it. And mainly it's because I saw this and I was gonna say something really probably inappropriate at work, so I just went and sat in my car and just was like, what the fuck? And then started processing all the news that was starting to come out and trying to read through a little bit of the changes that I had with my hour on lunch. So let me blow this up a little bit so you can see it a little bit better. Get my fat head out of the way. So this is really the only thing that is the important part for this particular post. And the reason I want to start with this, like I said, because you might see me lose my shit, because this makes me angry, honestly. The title that I'm going to put on this video is going to be probably hyperbolic as shit, but you know, you got to play the game. But I do legitimately believe that Blizzard completely fumbled the ball here and are going to fuck over the excitement for Season 1 of Dragonflight if they keep this dungeon pool in place. Now, I'm not talking about the 4 War Within dungeons. We literally know nothing about them right now, so other than some potential abilities that have been data mined out of the early alpha build with Dawnbreaker, Stone Vault, City of Threads, and Arakara. So we'll probably just call it Threads and Echoes. So I'm ignoring those because we legitimately don't know anything about them. It's these other 4 dungeons that I have severe problems with. If you've watched my YouTube video on, like, the Transcendence Tech, part 2 is coming. I might even record that tonight instead of playing keys. But if you watch part 1 of my Transcendence video, I say at one point, and I don't remember exactly where it's at, so apologies. You just have to watch the whole 50-minute video to find it. But at one point in that video, I talk about the fact that dungeons that play themselves are bad. During Niltheris, when I'm doing Niltheris Transcendence Tech, there's a part where I talk about chains. You can skip to that somewhere. It's chaptered out. And I basically said dungeons that play themselves are generally disliked. And Niltheris in Season 1 was generally disliked once people figured out chain tech. Because then the dungeon just became about, in terms of its trash, became just about how well can you use the chains and how much damage you can do. To the point that when Details has to completely, like, put out a new version, that separates the Neltharis chain damage from player, so that way you can get an accurate reading of your damage. Like, that's bad. Like, that is very bad. And the dungeon immediately becomes less fun, because then you don't have to actually figure anything out. The only thing you have to figure out is how big can you pull onto chains, how long can your tank live, and then finish off the damage accordingly. Beyond that, like, you don't actually do anything player-wise to positively impact that dungeon in that case. And so I have a real problem with dungeons that, as I call them, dungeons that play themselves. I don't know if Blizzard heard that and decided, hey, let's fuck with this guy, because they chose 3 dungeons that have aspects to them where the dungeon plays itself. What? Now, obviously, there's chances for everything to be reworked, but, like, that's not the point. The point is that you made an active decision to include these aspects. Like, there's a pattern here with these 3 out of these 4 dungeons. And the fact that you're actively making that choice tells me that you actively don't give a fuck about what players do in your dungeons. And you think that a dungeon playing itself is cool and fun and strategic. It is none of those. And you've seen it in practice for 3 expansions now. Like, this type of tech goes back to fucking BFA. And I'll explain why. Like, it may even go back further than that. I wasn't around in Legion, but ever since I've come back in BFA, dungeons that have aspects of them where they play themselves, you think Toldogor cannons, you think Siege of Borealis, we're going to talk about spotter tech. You think about Necrotic Wake and its weapons. You think about Grim Batol and its dungeon thing, which is obviously these dungeons here. Like, none of these dungeons are fondly remembered. And yet, you decided to go to the well on them again. And I think that I don't know who made the decision, Blizzard, to say, hey, let's do this. But whoever did clearly doesn't pay attention as much as I think that they would like them to. Because if you realize that you're picking dungeons where there's aspects where the dungeons play themselves, and these dungeons were pretty much universally despised as a result, and think, that's a great idea, let's put them all in a dungeon pool. I don't know what your intention was. Like, I just don't get it. I don't get it at all. And I'm very concerned for what that means for Season 1 of Dragonflight from a dungeon standpoint, a Mythic Plus standpoint. Like, there are 2 things that can destroy a season for Mythic Plus. And somehow Blizzard has accomplished both of them in the last, really in Dragonflight, really. Like, Season 1, it's poor dungeon pool. In Season 1, we saw that, because the non-Dragonflight dungeons, Temple of Jade Serpent, Shadow and Burial Grounds, Court of Stars, what was the other one? I don't remember off the top of my head. Like, these dungeons, like, they weren't very good. And then you had slow tuning on things like Ruby Life Pools and Azure Vault that it just made the season not fun to play, because you knew these dungeons were going to have mechanics and issues that you just couldn't do anything with. And that sucks. They just felt bad to play. And when you have a bad dungeon pool, that hurts a season. The second way that Blizzard can kill seasons is by having bad class tuning, which is what happened when AUG released. Like, the first half of Season 2 was okay. I think most people kind of like the dungeon pool with Underrot and Freehold, and and the other half of the Dragonflight dungeons, Halls of Infusion, wasn't really well liked, but the other 3 were kind of okay with like Brackenhide obviously being what turned out to be like a really, really fun dungeon to play once they made some targeted tweaks. But when God Comp came around with Bear, AUG, Mage, Warlock, Shadow Priest, and that comp went from not just being played at the very tippy top 0.1% of key, like the world first keys, but that comp was demanded by players being filtered all the way down to like 12s. It destroys a season. Like, I played a lot of Bear in Season 2. Like, I was a meta tank, and even I didn't enjoy it that much, because when I was trying to play Monk, or when I was trying to play my Warrior, or whatever the case may be, I would spend potentially up to hours in LFG simply because I wasn't one of 5 very specific specs. And that made Season 2 really, really bad to play. Season 3, I think overall, for Dragonflight, has been pretty good. The dungeon pool's been fine. I don't think it's the most spectacular in the world, but I think it's been all manageable. A couple of outliers in terms of keys, like most people don't like Rise. I'm personally not a huge fan of Throne of Tides. And I really don't like Darkheart Thicket. I actually think Darkheart is one of the worst Legion dungeons, and they could have picked 3 other dungeons at least from Legion that I would have loved to see more. But Darkheart is generally inoffensive. I just don't think it's good. So like the season 3 pool has been good, and class balance has been good. You know, obviously, you see certain specific meta comps, yes, and the rise of 4 DPS keys has been more prominent. But overall, like I've had basically the same wait times to get into keys on my Windwalker as I have on my Hunter, as I have on my Evoker, as I have on my Druid, in whatever role that I'm playing. And that to me is what has made Season 3 really fun. And I'm looking forward to Season 4 because outside of some defensive and utility power creep that Blizzard is still not fixed and probably won't fix at this point, I'm excited to see what Season 4 brings to the table. So, but like I said, one of the ways that Blizzard can kill a season is by having a very bad dungeon pool. Now, it is possible that Echoes, Threads, Stone Vault, and Dawnbreaker are all-time classic dungeons. And in a way, if all of these dungeons say hit the mark, maybe not necessarily, don't even have to be like completely S tier, but maybe they're all A tier, even B tier dungeons, I still think this season is a failure. So let's go back and let's talk about why I think that's the case. And it has nothing to do with the war within dungeons. I'm going to start from the bottom. Grim Batal. Grim Batal is from Cataclysm. Every dungeon that they've tried to rework out of Cataclysm, I think, has been bad. Throne of Tide sucked. You know, there was another one that they did from Cataclysm in Season 1 or Season 2, one of the two. But like, these dungeons are old enough that Blizzard has to put in extensive reworks into them. Like, they've had to fundamentally change how bosses work in order for them to be functional in a Mythic Plus setting. And I think that should tell you everything that you have to do. Like, when you basically have to redesign a dungeon in order to make it work for the modern game, you should probably just let that dungeon lie in its past. The other thing about Grim Batal is that its boss fights all generally suck. I don't think any of them are good. They're not interesting. They have mechanics that punish players unnecessarily, particularly the boss that has reflect mechanics. Like, that's bad. And Grim Batal was really one of the first dungeons that I can recall, at least, that has this aspect of it, which was pretty cool at the time because it was very, very unique. But over time has grown to be like very tiresome in that it has a section where you clear a section of the dungeon by basically doing nothing. And what I mean by that is in the middle of Grim Batal, if any of you guys have played it in Cataclysm Time Walking or anything like that, is that you jump a dragon and then you just bomb your mobs in a hallway. After you cross a rock, you can start bombing mobs. Whatever you don't kill has the health remaining, you go and you finish it off. With good coordination, that's going to basically clear out a huge chunk of trash, and then you have to walk like 6 minutes because you can't mount in the dungeon. So you have a long walk, and if your group is poor, then you didn't even kill everything. You have to then stop and kill trash before you can even get over to the next boss, which isn't even in that hallway. It's off on a side tangent and go from there. This dungeon has too much downtime, too much running with no incentive to do anything. You're just running. And in Mythic Plus scenarios, especially in timed Mythic Plus scenarios, that's not fun. Players hate that. That's why DOS was pretty much not enjoyed. It's because you'd spend 4 minutes of that dungeon running, and then it was like a 46-minute timer as a result of it. Because Blizzard had to account for that runtime. Grim Batal is going to be like a 40-minute key, and I don't like that. I don't like dungeons, like, honestly, like, even 36-minute dungeons are too long. So, unless they do something dramatic to change this dungeon, like, this dungeon is just not going to be fun. I don't think it's going to be fun. Too much downtime, too much walking, a dragon section that isn't even fun to do because there's no feedback loop on it. Like, you don't see a damage number. Like, how is it going to get tracked? Like, how are you going to know what mobs you killed? all that stuff. And then on top of that, it's a dungeon that the boss fights in them kind of suck, and I expect them to be reworked, but the ones that are going to kind of maintain some of the core principles, they are going to be very bad to face on Tyrannical. They're just going to be bad. Like, this dungeon, before any changes are going in, is going to be like F tier bad, I think. And the fact that Blizzard is probably going to have to basically redesign the dungeon from the floor up in order to make it feel good for Mythic Plus just tells me you should just not even bother. Leave, particularly Cataclysm dungeons, leave them in the dust. Now, I know with like time running remakes, they were probably wanted to be hesitant about doing Pandaria dungeons because you're going to be doing all of them in remix. But bring back another WoD dungeon. Like, the WoD dungeons haven't been bad. Shadow Moon Burial Grounds wasn't good, but admittedly that was because it was undertuned. Grimrail Depot was a community vote, so I blame them for that. But Iron Docks banged. I loved Iron Docks. So good. Even though you had the cannon section, it didn't affect the enemies. It only affected the players. So you couldn't even use cannon tech to like kill that trash in that little cannon gauntlet efficiently. You had to still do it on your own, which was cool. And it forced you to have good positioning. It was like, that's why I loved Iron Docks. But there are plenty of other, like Everbloom, okay, not the best, but I'm sure there are other WoD dungeons. Again, I didn't play WoD. But I'm sure there's other WoD dungeons that you could look at and say, hey, maybe we try this one. Or you pick a Legion dungeon that people like. You know, I don't think this one's very good, but... oh, it's Halls of Valor. That was the Season 1 dungeon. I don't think this one was very good, but like Temple of the Magistrate. Bring that one back instead. You know, maybe they're wanting to give Legion dungeons a couple seasons to cool off, and I'm okay with that because we've had Darkheart, and we've had Blackrock Cold, we've had Quarter Stars, we've had quite a few Legion dungeons, and so letting them lie for a little bit is probably okay. But if that means you're picking a dungeon like Grim Batal, I kind of want you to just go back to the well on a Legion dungeon again. So anyways, let's move on. Siege of Borealis. Siege of Borealis from Battle for Azeroth. I don't think I need to explain too much why this dungeon is awful. You know, it even says here on the Wowhead post, the dreaded Siege of Borealis from Battle of Azeroth. Like, even Wowhead is like, yo, this is questionable. The Siege of Borealis, for anyone that wasn't aware, had two different experiences depending on what faction you were in. If you were Alliance, you got one type of experience. If you were Horde, you got a different type of experience. Now, generally speaking, I don't know how this is going to work now with cross-faction. They're going to have to do some crazy tech, probably like they did with Dawn of the Infinite, where maybe it tunes to the party leader's faction, where depending on what your party leader was, or the majority of the group was, your time-lost battlefield changed between Gromash or Endo and Lothar. They probably do something like that, where the experience that you have is going to be different, but then they need to make some changes to make the experiences similar. Because Alliance players, their Siege of Borealis, no matter what, was a minute longer. I think it was a minute. Because you had extra RP lines at the end of Siege of Borealis before you fight Viscoth. Right. So that probably needs to be changed and updated so that there's uniformity there. That way, you don't get basically RNG'd on whether you're doing the Horde side or the Alliance experience on it. The other thing that is a big problem with Siege of Borealis is, again, it goes back to this dungeon playing itself thing. And that's spotter tech. So the spotters are basically, I think it's Ashvane spotters, I think was what they were called. They were basically mobs that would fire off like these cannon barrages that if you stood inside the little circles, you would take damage. But it was friendly fire. So the mobs you could put mobs in there and mobs would take damage. And when people discovered that, what would happen is that they would pull these big packs, do everything they can to keep the spotters alive as long as humanly possible, and then find a way to basically make it so that your tank would tank mobs just outside these circles, and the spotter damage cannons would actually just kill the mobs, because they would do like 10% of their 10 to 15% of their HP on every cannon hit. And it's just not fun to like do that. It's okay for a tank because it's like, hey, I got to figure out how to wrap up all these mobs, and the ones that sit there and cast, how do we get them into these spotter circles? Like, there's some gameplay for tanks, but for everyone else, you're just kind of waiting for the spotter stuff to happen, and then you can kill the spotter. Like, that's not fun. That's not engaging. That's not unique gameplay, you know? And then, like, the last boss, you don't even fight the boss. You just fight a bunch of ads and then fire a cannon that an NPC fixes, and then you move on with your life. Like, Viscoth is supposed, and if you played the Alliance campaign in Tiergard Sound, you know that he's like this massive octopus-like creature that is built up to be kind of scary at the end of the Tiergard Sound thing, and then you just fire a few cannons at him and kill him. And you never once actually engage with fighting him. Like, you don't attack him once, you attack his tentacles. Like, it's very, like, Deathwing-like in that Spine of Deathwing, you just killed all the spines, and then with Deathwing itself, you basically just attacked his arms until the fight was over. Like, that fight is not remembered well for a reason, and Viscoth falls into the same pattern. In between that, like, you have your cannon boss, which is like a lot of responsibility being put on one player while you're trying to dodge swirlies, and has intermittent ad fights in it. Like, that fight just is not fun. The third boss, the big, like, horror monster, that's pretty cool, but even then there's line of sight mechanics involved with that boss, which aren't fun. Like, players don't like line of sighting in the middle of their boss fights. That's why the third boss of Throne of Tides kind of sucks too. And all of those boss fights were pretty punishing for, like, no reason. Like, if you screwed it up, like, if you had a player with the cannon that didn't do the cannon right, your fight was like 3 minutes longer. And it was, especially on Tyrannical. And it's just not fun, man. Like, the thing that really bothers me about Siege of Paralis is that, like, you have Motherlode sitting right there. Like, dude, Motherlode, like, one of the best dungeons, in my opinion, the best dungeon from that expansion, sitting there. Now, Motherlode admittedly needs some tweaks. There's way too much trash in there, and you can fix that. You can either up the count necessary, or you remove some mobs and things like that. But, like, you could mount. You could, so that you could traverse your travel better. The trash mobs were interesting and cool. The boss fights were interesting and cool. The last boss's intermission, not so much. But it was still, like, they all had interesting and fun mechanics to do. Like, you had your, the first boss, you had, like, the flame cannon and the wind, and the second boss, you had your ad maintenance, which, I mean, is DK, you were loving life, but everyone else, you kind of hated it. And, but, like, all the boss fights there, I think, were fun to do, whether it was Tyrannical or Fortified. And the trash, for the most part, was really fun to do. Some of them that were annoying, some things that probably needed to be tweaked and adjust. But, I mean, because we've seen even with Dragonflight, like, stuff that was made literally, like, within the last 2 years. Was it not even the last 2 years? Yeah, it's about 2 years, 18 months or so. They've had to make massive changes to the dungeons that they're bringing back for Season 4. So you'd expect to see some tweaks made. But, like, Motherlode was legitimately a fun dungeon. And a lot of people have it in their top, like, 3 to 4 for that expansion. Nobody that I talked to liked Siege of Paralis. It was basically right next to Toldagor for the most hated dungeon in BFA. And yet they chose it. Why? Paralis, fantastic city. Best capital city that they've ever made, in my opinion. That's not how I want to go back to Paralis. I want to go back to Paralis because I want to go back to Paralis. I don't want to go back to Paralis because I have to do the worst dungeon from that expansion. And yes, it was worse than King's Rest. Which brings us to Necrotic Wake, which is from Shadowlands. Was one of the dungeons in the Kyrian section. And the big thing, there are two things really that concern me with this dungeon. One is, how are they going to handle the Covenant exclusive buffs? Because if someone has to go travel back to frickin' Bastion to become a Kyrian so that you could take advantage of Golem buffs, bad. So you either remove the Covenant buffs completely, or you make them usable by any player regardless. I would prefer that you just remove them because all of them kind of sucked and weren't fun. I mean, a couple of them you had to play entirely around them. Necrotic Wake was one, because when you had Golem Orbs and stuff like that, like, you wanted to pull bigger because you were doing bigger damage. And, like, again, just not fun. The other thing about Necrotic Wake is that you had weapons that were scattered throughout the dungeon. and you had to use them wisely until people figured out how to use them effectively, was just pulling everything and then hitting all your weapons. Why? Like, what purpose does that serve? The first 2/3 of the dungeon practically played themselves, and even then, you maintained weapons all the way up until the last boss, so that you could then just burn the last boss by throwing literally every spear and hammer and orb and all that shit that you had at that boss, because it kind of also sucked on Tyrannical. The first boss had area denial that felt unfair at times because it wasn't really like you had to do mob control on it, so there's a little bit of skill aspect to it, but like it became super punishing because you couldn't use the entire space that you had because you generally only pulled one side of the room. So you had to go basically up and down one side of the room, and on tyrannical keys that boss had way too much health and would just take forever. So that was bad. The dragon boss before the third boss, like you basically just orbed it and it died. And if you didn't have your orbs or you didn't have a spear, you really didn't enjoy your life. If you didn't have good coordinated CCs on the ads, particularly anything that would happen before the big explosion, you would just get wiped, and people didn't know why until you had to figure out how to kill the ads or CC them. The third boss with the hook mechanic, the hook was jank. It was very jank. Like, you'd throw it straight at the boss, and sometimes it just wouldn't hook him. And then if you screwed up a hook, it put you way behind on the ads, and therefore put you way behind on the boss, and it just took forever. And then the last boss sent one party member down onto the side of the necropolis to basically do nothing but run a dodge a swirly gauntlet, which for some specs was really easy. Like Monk, it was really easy. Druid, it was pretty easy because you could travel form while charge it. Monk, obviously, you had roll. We used Chi Torpedo a lot back then too. You had Flying Serpent Kick as Windwalker. But then like some specs like DK and Priest, and to a lesser extent Paladin, like they struggled. Warlock was another one where like they would just go down there forever and not even like bother with it. Now sometimes it was fun, where if you timed your invis correctly or you timed a feign death correctly, you'd force your partner to go down there. But generally speaking, when it was easier to just go down there, die, take your 5-second penalty, get ported back to the top and get battle rezzed, when that was the best strategy for dealing with that mechanic, yeah, that's bad. So this dungeon like had no good bosses. I thought none of these bosses were fun. It played itself because of all the stuff involving orbs and spears and axes and shit like that. Not even to mention that the area that in the third boss's room that you'd go up to, the necropolis, like certain ground targeted spells just didn't work. Like warlocks couldn't rain a fire in that dungeon when you're up in the necropolis. Like Starfall was the same way because Starfall was targeted on the ground at the time. Like you just couldn't do it. So like, what? So like, yeah, just these three dungeons. I'm fucking angry. I hate it. Mist of Tyrannus Scythe. Now this one is probably going to be the most controversial take that I have. I think Mist of Tyrannus Scythe is a bad dungeon. Now when I was doing it at the time, I didn't hate it all the time. But with the benefit of hindsight, this dungeon I don't think is as good as people remember it. And there's a few reasons why. And we're going to start at the beginning of the dungeon. Number one, you had to have a Night Fae to go the fastest route. And you had to have a Night Fae in order to unlock checkpoints. Now that whole expansion, Blizzard was completely shit about checkpoints in their dungeons. So that's kind of was like just par for the course. We just kind of got used to it. But like dungeon checkpointing, for people that don't understand how important it is, it's like one of the most valuable things that Blizzard can do well in a dungeon. It literally elevates a dungeon from bad to manageable if there's good checkpointing in the boss fights. And if there's not, it feels really bad. Think about in like Everbloom, where if like you die before third boss, instead of spawning at the location where you fought the little council, you spawn at the beginning of the dungeon. And every time it feels bad. Mist of Tyrannus Scythe, you had good checkpoints, which, again, I think made people think the dungeon was better than what it was. But if you didn't have a Night Fae, you couldn't access the checkpoints, which means when you released at the start of the dungeon and had to run all the way through. So that's really shit thing about Mist Part 1. Part 2, the trash before the first boss kind of all sucks. Like, you have the big trees, which are a pain in the ass to fight, were really bad on particular weeks when you had affixes such as, like, Necrotic in particular, but Necrotic was worse in the second third of the last third of the dungeon. But, like, those mobs were infinitely more, had much more health. So things like bolstering and raging just felt really brutal for DPS tanks and healers alike. Not to mention you had to have quick on your feet thinking with some of the trash around it in order to keep it kicked, but also like not try to kill it too fast. Like, it was just all a pain in the ass. And then you did an invis gate skip in order to avoid more trash, because you would go way over count in that dungeon if you just pressed W. And then you had to go get another Night Fae to open up the mushrooms so that you could get more damage. And the mushrooms became mandatory in the higher the keys that you went, because then you wouldn't have the DPS to kill the first boss, especially in higher tyrannical keys. That first boss was a very strict and tight DPS check for no reason. And it's not like I'm talking about like the highest of keys. Like, that key was being done at 31 if I recall, in BFA. Like, that key started becoming, like, that DPS check became super tight at like 17s. And that is bad. That means your scaling was fucked. And they could never fix it because of the way that fight worked. Where basically, when Droman was available, he took 90% less damage. So you were forced to switch to this ad. And that's half your fight, is just killing this ad until he hits like 5% health, breaks free of the control temporarily, and does something that allows you to then do giga damage to the boss. And then once the boss got out of that stun and re-controlled Droman and got his damage reduction again, it was rinse and repeat. All the while, there's tons of space denial going out, tons of random damage going out for no fucking reason, and that DPS check was super tight. Even at like 18 keys, if you're 17, 18 keys, if your goal was to just time the key, you knew within the first like 10 minutes of that key if you were going to time it or not. Because if you didn't, at worst, 2-phase the first boss, the key was over. Even if nobody died, if everyone's playing perfectly, if you didn't have the damage to kill that boss within 2, and ideally you did it in 1 phase, but if you didn't do it in 2 phases, your key was dead. You weren't going to time it. It didn't matter what else you did in that key. It was over. And that's horrible design. And then we move on to the Moonberry puzzle. Now, in theory, I think this was a cool idea. What happened in practice is that people just got a weak aura that puzzle solved it for you. And initially it was just like, oh, you put in the logos that you see and it'll tell you which one. And then the weak aura game evolved on it to where like people figured out what all the patterns were. To where once you put in the first pattern, you didn't have to interact with the puzzle anymore, because the weak aura would tell you exactly which path to go. Because it knew based off of whatever was the first pattern, here's the rest of it. When a weak aura makes the dungeon 5 minutes faster for you, that's a problem. Bad design. Poor design. Not to mention that Lady Moonberry was also bad. She was not fun. And if you had like an all melee group, she was overtly punishing because of the fox mechanic. Like, punishing for no reason. And then the trash after the second boss, again, if you didn't get your checkpoint at the bottom of the waterfall, you were going all the way back to the beginning. And then the trash after the third boss with all the gorms and the flies, like, not necessarily bad. Heaven forbid you miss the shield kick, though, because if you didn't have a priest to dispel it, and it was only, I think it was only mass dispel or purge. So if you didn't have a priest or shaman, heaven forbid you're killing that mob for an extra 15 seconds on tyrannical and probably like an extra 45 seconds on fortified, because that shield was big for no reason. Like, it punished you heavily for missing a kick. And then it was just Dispel City, like Poison Cleansing Totem would have been great there because it didn't exist. Your healer was stressed out from having to Poison Dispel. You had to bring other Poison Dispel classes. Monk was very good in there for that reason. Druid was very good in there for that reason, because you just had your Poison Dispel. And then, yeah, it had circles that could potentially boop you off the tree branches, but that's more of like, I didn't mind that mechanic because it basically was like, yo, stand in the swirl and you find, fuck around and find out. But then again, if you died, you didn't spawn back on the area that you at. You just stayed in the pit and were forced to release. Guess what? If you didn't have your checkpoints, you didn't have a night fag, where were you releasing? The very beginning, where, by the way, you did an invis skip or a warlock gate skip. If you don't have an invis potion or stealth, you're now screwed because you can't get by the mobs that you skipped earlier in the dungeon. And then the last boss was just a massive hit point sponge, to the point that it wasn't fun. Because when she'd spawn all of her swirlies and stuff, like, it was there. Like, that boss was garbage. Like, people kind of hate Yasma because, like, just things happen and that boss takes forever to kill. The last boss in Mist of Tyranid Scythe is the exact same thing as Yasma. So to have that dungeon be in this pool, Mist of Tyranid Scythe, like, people remember it fondly, and I don't understand why. I never liked Mist. I hated Mists. I thought it was one of the worst dungeons of Shadowlands. Like, I know there are going to be people that disagree with me. I know there are people that are excited to see Mists again. I am not. I am not excited to see Mists again. So these 4 dungeons, to me, they're all, like, at best, D tier dungeons. So again, half your dungeons are D or F tier. If these 4 War Within dungeons are the 4 best dungeons Blizzard has ever made, the season is a failure. And I have a fucking problem with that. And Blizzard, you can fucking do better. You have time, change these dungeons. If you're insistent on bringing back Shadowlands dungeons, bring back the ones that people actually liked. Because Necrotic Wake wasn't it. Spires of Ascension, not it. Like, the Shadowlands dungeons in general, not very well received. Halls of Atonement, you can bring back. I think people would be happy with that. I'd personally be okay with Sanguine Depths. I enjoyed Sanguine Depths. Tazavesh was the best dungeon that expansion had. So, like, and that's, like, the thing that is, like, you have those options on the table, and Mists is the one that you choose. Like, again, I don't understand why you thought this was a good idea. Like, there has to be a way for you to be able to get feedback from players ahead of time and saying, hey, here's some dungeons that we're thinking about. What do you think? And I guarantee you, Necrotic Wake and Mist of Tyranid Scythe probably wouldn't have been the top 2 dungeons on that list. Halls of Atonement absolutely would have been the number 1 dungeon on that list. And I think Sanguine Depths might have been number 2. It's just like, my excitement for season 1 of War Within is significantly hampered because I love Mythic Plus. Like, it is the thing that I love the most about this game, other than breaking down classes. And to have these 4 dungeons that are all fundamentally extremely flawed and poorly designed dungeons all grouped together in one season when it's half your dungeon pool is disheartening. It is very disheartening. And like I said, Echoes, Threads, Vault, and Breaker could be 4 the greatest dungeons you have ever made in your life. But when I don't get one of those keys, I'm going to feel bad. I'm going to be less motivated to play dungeons and to do Mythic Plus. Because these 4 dungeons are just god awful. They are so bad. And I don't know how the decision was made to make these the 4 dungeons. Now, again, there are going to be aspects of them that I think are taken out, and maybe some things that are a little bit added in that can make all of these better. You better fucking nail it, or this season and Mythic Plus is going to fail. It is going to fail.